My fellow old rollers, welcome to the podcast. A huge hero of mine, the giant killer of ADCC 2019, the Velociraptor, second degree black belt, Lachlan Giles. Lachlan, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So excited, and leading in, I want to sincerely apologize to both my listeners and to you. We recorded this episode previously, and we had the same audio issue that we've had a couple of times. So we've basically completely changed up our technology for recording. But what this means is I got to come and bug you and spend another hour of your time talking to some hillbilly from Kentucky on behalf of the 40 plus old roller crowd. But super glad to have you, and you're just such a gentleman for coming back. I can't thank you enough.
No worries. No, it's an important topic, so I'm excited to share this information. Hopefully it's helpful.
Well, it's going to be, because, listening to the playback from the first one, if we get half of what you passed on in that one, then we're going to pass on some life-changing info to some folks for training. You have some extremely innovative ideas, and your experience base as both a physio and a high-level competitor is extremely powerful to bring that knowledge down to those of us regular folk. I don't know. Can you hear me? Because suddenly you've gone silent. I don't know if your mic turned off or. Let's see. There you are. No, it lost you again. Not yet.
What about now?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Can you hear this? Do I tap that?
I did not.
This Zoom must be doing something funny. Oh, there we are. Oh no, let's speak. This should be better. Audio.
Okay, I have your professional mic now. I can definitely tell the difference.
That's good. All right, that's good. I put the headphones on because I was listening and I could hear buzzing from Messenger making noises, and I figured that would annoy me. So I thought if I put, or at least might be annoying for the audio, but yeah, all right. Well, I'll just leave them off. I won't interrupt what we're doing. So yeah,
that's all good. But that mic sounds tremendous. So yeah, awesome.
Okay, good.
So to lead in, we were talking about your experience base, both in your previous profession as a physiotherapist, and then as a competitor, as a coach, as a teacher. There's this kind of conglomeration where you at the same time, deal with a lot of injury rehabilitation in, the physio side, but then on the coach and the athlete side, you're trying to, avoid injury and get peak performance while not tearing the body down to the point where, you take it to a place where it can't recover. And yeah. I'd like to get your thoughts on that idea of like an ideal training split or combination of volume intensity, based on those three realms that you work in all the time.
Yeah, so I think that's where it starts to, you have to really identify what you're doing jiu-jitsu for, because I think if you want to be an athlete, you kind of by definition, like as in if you want to compete, and especially at a high level, and if that's your goal, you do kind of have to push your body past what it potentially could handle for a very long term, as in like you'll probably get some wear and tear that will come back to bite you when you're older. And that's something I had to kind of accept that, sure. Like a risk I was, I guess, willing to take. And because really, like to be, for example, to be ready for competition, you need to be training at an intensity that mimics competition, which is very high. Like that's near, you need to at some point be going 100% of your capacity in training. And that's really like, it's hard to do that on the regular and also not accumulate trauma to your joints and so on. So I think if someone's aiming to be a elite competitor and they're training at that level, then they should be realizing the cost of that. And I suppose that's something I had to sort of weigh up. And I think there's you can train in a way that's, we'll probably get into it, but you can train in a way that I think minimizes that. Like as in like, I think I try to approach it in an intelligent way, but I still realize that it's not perfect. You will have some long-term consequences. But for someone whose goal is to, they just want to roll and improve at jiu-jitsu, and obviously there's the competitive side, you'll never take that away, but there might be people who just want to roll and at the gym do well without having a real mind to trying to get out there and fight the best in the world, or even just even in local competitions to compete quite hard. Like if you're not trying to prepare for competition, I think the intensity to go at should be quite a lot lower, because it's just better for your joints. I'd say we're talking about intensity, we're talking about volume and the likes, and which type of movements we're doing, but every time you up the intensity, it's almost like an exponential curve for how much load is going through your body. A good example is like sprinting. Like a sprinter will experience nearly 12 times body weight, like through their joints and their legs, as they do their exercise, even though they obviously weigh 1 time their body weight, but what they experience through their joints, because they are going like maximum force, and a lot of the force that can actually occur comes from now you're like elevating your center of gravity and dropping it, and having your muscles and everything's kind of activating to increase pressure and generate power. But that kind of translates into a lot more load than, for example, walking, which even though you might you could maybe walk at, I'm going to make up numbers here, but you could maybe walk at 5 kilometers an hour. I'm talking in metric system here, so maybe a lot of the listeners won't get that, but you could maybe walk at like 5 kilometers an hour and sprint at 20 kilometers an hour. So it might only be four times faster than you can walk, but the magnitude is exponential in terms of the loading that your joints will have. And you can even experience that in the amount you get very tired, even though it's only 4 times as intense, as fast. It's not 4 times more tired than from walking. It's magnitudes higher than that. So it's the same with the load on your joints from the intensity that you roll at. So if you roll, if you go to roll and you go to you fight like it's the world championship final at every session, like you're really pushing the limits of what your body can handle. And for some, it might be that 99% of the time you go to training and that's fine, but the one time you kind of overdo it, it starts to accumulate trauma, and that can be a problem.
Yeah, I think we had talked about that a little bit in the previous one, that you get a lot of false positives when you go to that 100% place too often and you don't get injured by it, and then all of a sudden you've sort of built up this. It's almost like pulling a rubber band. You've built up a lot of elastic tension in the potential to have an injury. But every time it kept reinforcing when it wasn't happening that you were fine, until that one time that it's not fine. That's
the hard one, right? Because it's any time in any single training session, your chance of getting injured is quite low. It's actually probably extremely low. But if you're training, 300, let's say you're training, more days a week than you're not, let's say 250 days a week, then even if there's a 1 in 250 chance you get injured today, it seems like good odds. Like, I've only got 1 in 250 chance I injure myself. So you'll probably go at that pace. But if you actually took a long-term view and said like, okay, if I go at this pace, what are the chances that, over the next year or over the next 2 years I get injured? you'd probably come in with quite a different result, which is going to be quite high. And probably that's how I think people should look at it in terms of adjusting their training load and intensity, really.
So what are some methods, because just to give, kind of an example, there's quite a few people, especially starting out, that don't have a real concept of how to modulate how they roll. Like they basically just roll the same way, which is, they feel like they're in a fight. Over time you grow out of that, and it takes a while for different people. It's longer or shorter. But is there a method where you could almost periodize within your training to modulate up and modulate down, like changing the volume and the intensity from that 100% like you're preparing for competition, versus I think the language that you had used for it in our previous discussion was a skill acquisition phase, where you're at a lower intensity, higher volume, and trying to dial in a technique?
Yeah. So that's the way I approach it is, like for me, the majority of the difference in a match is going to come down to skill. And I think jiu-jitsu is like to an extreme almost. Like you can put two people against each other in the gym, and even usually just by looking at the belt, like if it's a brown against a purple belt and they're kind of reflective of their rank and they might be the same size, you could bet that probably like 99 times out of 100, it would be the brown belt that wins. So I feel like the skill part is the most important part of jiu-jitsu to develop. And I think that can be done at a low, like I actually find it hard to develop new skills if I'm going 100%. I find that difficult because I'm so focused on winning and trying to get the grips and do the move that I'm actually not paying attention to what the problems are and what I could do to improve it. If I tend to back it off a little bit in terms of intensity, I'll say 70%, which if you back it off a bit, I find you can be aware of why it's not working. Like I went for that leg, but they blocked, they got an underhook. Okay. Next time I'm going to, come up with a different strategy so that doesn't happen. And you can kind of adapt and learn really well from that. So for me, the majority of my training is focused on that. And it's also, I think whenever you drop the volume, whenever you drop the intensity, you can increase your volume and still be less chance of getting injured. Does that make sense? So,
yes,
you might be able to do at 100%, for me, if I go 100, if I'm going hard, like competition style, I'll probably do like 30 minutes of training in that session, like 30 minutes of rolling, and that's it for the day. Because I just can't, I'm 33, my body won't, it's too risky to do more than that. And I know there's probably people a lot older than that, but whereas I could go 70% for 2 hours potentially. No, I don't ever just roll for 2 hours, but I'll do like drills, situational training, and rolling over about a 2-hour period, and that's the majority of my training. So it allows you to do more, but it's also safer. So that's my like skill acquisition period, and that's the majority of my training. And then usually over like an 8 to 12 week period, in the lead up to a comp, I'll tend to put more intensity in. It doesn't mean every day is like that, but more intensity in, and I take the volume down. So that probably brings us to the next point. Like perhaps the biggest predictor of people getting injured is a change in training load. So it's not, they've done lots of studies on, and this is something that frustrates me sometimes, because people come up to me like, oh, because my hips internally rotated and that's why I have back pain or something. And actually, if you look at the data we have on this, it's extremely difficult to, in fact, it's basically, there's almost no predictive value at all on people's biomechanical issues, predicting them from getting injuries. It doesn't mean they're not a factor. So it's like, it can be something you can try to address in treatment, but by far the best predictive thing for injury is someone changing their training load. So that could be, you could be going, let's say I was doing training twice a week and I changed that to 4 times a week. That's now a massive increase in training volume. And if you think about it, every tissue in my body that does jiu-jitsu is not used to that. So it could be it's a kind of a question of which is going to get injured first. Is it your knee or a muscle, tendon? Everything is taking a shock to the system, and it either adapts to it or it gets injured. And maybe 95% of your tissues do adapt, but the one that gets injured is the one that you find out about. So a change in training load. I think it was, I'm trying to remember the best stat for this. There was one done by the Australian Institute of Sport, which found if you took your monthly training load, and then, so that's like your average training load is like what you've done over the past month. And then if in any 1 week, your training load is increased by 30% over what your monthly average was. So you've suddenly like gone up 30% over your average week. Then for the next 6 weeks, you were at elevated risk of getting injured. I think it was a considerably higher amount. I'm not going to say a number because it'll probably be off, but it'll be somewhere like it's enough to be
statistically
something you want to. Yeah, it's significant. I probably should look up and get the reference for that paper. So that's something you really want to be aware of. And I think a lot of people then think about their training load as in not going up too fast. Like if you are going to go up, you want to be incremental, like if it's, probably less than 10% change and, over the weeks, and then you can get to where you want to get in a reasonably safe manner where your body can adapt to the load you're doing. Where people have issues, and I see this a lot actually, is if you stop training, then once you stop training, you actually decondition your monthly load, and tolerance is actually starting to drop. So some people, they're fine, they're training, they go on a holiday for a few weeks, come back from the holiday and do their normal routine, and they've actually deconditioned, and that is a big step up in their training load, and they'll get injured from that. So trying to even if you have a rest, you kind of need to build up from a low thing back to your normal routine. I think that's one where people get caught a lot. And you see this, I see this, it could be two things, but like there's these people that tend to get injured a lot. And what will happen is they train hard, they get injured, then they'll have like a month off, and then they come back and they train hard again. And they're actually just adding to that, like cumulative. That's like probably the worst model I could possibly give someone to stay in jiu-jitsu a long time, because you're deconditioning and then you're overloading and deconditioning and overloading, and you're never actually achieving that steady kind of training. Whereas I maybe over 10 years ago, I had knee surgery, but since I got back into it, like I would say I never had a break over 1 week from training. And I think that's one reason why at 33, I'm able to still compete at a high level. Like I try to keep a consistent training load. I think that's really, really important. So how do I adapt that? How do I use that information in like preparing for a tournament? I go from a lower in intensity, like that skill acquisition phase. And occasionally, even within that, you might have your day or two where you do have hard rolls, maybe once a week or so. Like, it's not that you kind of still need some feeling for what it's like when you're going hard, but
everybody's got that partner that it's going to be, it's going to be a war.
That's right. So I tend to then when I start upping the intensity, I reduce the volume, so that way the overall actual load is stays somewhat similar. One way they did it with that AIS study, they actually took and they actually, a lot of elite sporting clubs do this. And if you want to, this is probably not a bad idea, but they would take the time that you train for and multiply it by how hard you felt the session was. So like, let's say out of 10. And that's how they're working their training load. So if you had a 10 out of 10, like you went, you were tired, you felt that was a hard session, and it was for an hour, then that would be, maybe in minutes, 60 times 10. And that would give you a score of 600. And then you can kind of get your weekly load and your monthly load if you're actually like monitoring that for a while, and then you could potentially recognize a bit earlier, like, oh, this week I'm actually starting to hit towards my what I should be doing this week, like, and kind of back off from that. To be honest, I don't do it. I just do that based off how I feel. But if I was in a sporting team, it would be much more like an elite sporting team. It would be much more closely monitored like that, and it's been shown to reduce the risk of injury. They do that a lot in top sporting teams. So you'd be welcome to do it yourself. It's nice when someone else is doing it for you, though.
Yeah.
That
reminds me a lot of some of the powerlifting training that I had done in the past, and there were some programming methods that use what they called RPE, or rate of perceived exertion.
That's it.
And so you would modulate within, like if you had a mesocycle that was prescribed, if all of a sudden 3 weeks into your 4-week mesocycle, you're feeling like you're RPE 10 and you're supposed to be RPE 7, then you got to back it down, because something is triggering this heightened feeling of just being worn out. So you're self-modulating, similar to what you're describing.
Yes. Yeah, that's it is used quite a lot in the strength and conditioning field, isn't it? It's yeah.
And just for the listeners, don't go looking for my powerlifting total. It's really embarrassing. I only did one meet. I bombed out of it. I'm basically soccer dad strong, which is not that strong at all. So you're not going to hear any tales of my world records or anything like that. I don't want to sound like I'm trying to impress anybody.
Yeah, actually, that's getting on to strength training. So, because that was another topic we were discussing, isn't it? It was so that's something that's been shown. Like, strength training has been shown to reduce injury in just about every study that's ever looked at strength training as a supplement to sport has shown a reduction in injury. So it's something I would recommend to people, but I don't always take my own recommendation because I actually don't do it myself. I personally have found, like, for myself, I tend to put on muscle size pretty easily, and I feel like I'm strong for my division. But so from a performance perspective, I haven't necessarily found, and to be honest, I don't enjoy lifting weights. That's probably the real reason. But I haven't found doing strength training to be my favorite use of my time. So I actually don't do it, but there are a lot of studies showing that it's beneficial. And I think especially you do notice there's a body type, those people who tend to be a bit more skinny, have less muscle bulk to support their joints. I do find tend to get injured more often. So I think especially if you're in that category, doing strength training, if anything, just to supplement and reduce your chance of injury. I do think I often tell people to avoid, apart from for that purpose, like I often tell people not to do it for performance, even though it could help their performance. I feel like the same time spent working your technique can be beneficial, but that's my own opinion. There's plenty of people who are good at jiu-jitsu who do strength training programs, and that obviously helps. So
this other fellow named Marcelo Garcia that some may have heard of, he also says that your strength conditioning time would be better spent just doing more jiu-jitsu.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as I said, there's almost like a different question. Like there's a question, what's the best use of your time for improving, as in like having better performance in jiu-jitsu. And there's another question of what's best for injury prevention. And without a doubt, it's shown that strength training will help with injury prevention. But again, we have to look at the loading, so like if you're doing your same program, your same weekly load of jiu-jitsu and you add strength and conditioning, you have to be careful not to do too much, so like, especially while you're adapting to it, you'll probably have to back off some of your jiu-jitsu training while you build up a tolerance to strength training, and then find a way to integrate them if you're going to do it that way. So,
and I think what you described previously about your personal training protocol, if a change in training load is your biggest, is a really, really big risk factor for injury. By keeping your training load always consistent, you're very conscious of your training load. You may not need that strength and conditioning push to preserve yourself from injury, quote unquote, because you're doing the right things within the training as far as like your consistency of volume and intensity, so that you're not putting yourself in that, that sort of heightened percentage for outdoing yourself.
Yeah, actually, I should this is applicable as well, but there's kind of two types of injuries. There's the I like to break it down to like there's injuries where someone, for example, someone collects your knee or you twist your knee in a funny way, which is kind of like an injury from like overstretching the joint, and it could be your fault. It could be that you did a silly movement and you injured your leg. Or it could be someone's landed on your leg, or any part of the body that can occur. And that's not necessarily so much related to training load. That's related to your joint was taken past its available range. Yeah. And then there's the other type of injury, which is a more overload related injury. And that's where this, which is, you hear of people. Actually, it does get a little bit funny, but like, if someone tears their bicep tendon, they'll probably remember one incident like, oh yeah, I tried to get out of an arm bar. But tendons don't just tear. Like you had wear and tear in your bicep if that happened. Like tendons don't just rupture from a healthy tendon, or it's extremely rare for a healthy tendon to rupture. It's usually you've got a lot of wear and tear in there, and then this was the final straw. So it can be hard to differentiate what was the causative, or whether it sits in category A or B there. But that's where this training volume and modulation is really important, and training load. So the more you push that training load boundary, the more you make your tissues vulnerable to injury. But whereas stepping and someone comes across your knee and you tear your ACL, like you could do all the training modulation you want in the world. If that happens, that's going to happen, So, but even for something like that, the strength training can help. So having like a more supporting musculature around the joint can help you. If someone does crash on your knee and you kind of like everything holds it in together, and you've got good muscle strength to support that, you're less likely to get injured for that. So, I think that's one of the reasons why the skinnier people get injured. They've got less muscles to support any kind of unnatural movement that occurs. And I think going at that higher intensity is much more likely to lead to those acute sort of injuries. And probably the other thing is the style of jiu-jitsu that you play, which, do you want me to get onto that? Should I get onto that? Yeah,
I mean, you're the boss here. Like, I'm trying to just take notes and write down everything that you're saying. Like, this is amazing.
So yeah, I think the other thing is another very important factor is the style, is in like what type of guard you play, but also the do you do wrestling for, like stand up and takedowns wrestling? The type of guard you play is going to certain guards will put a lot of pressure on your back. Certain ones will put it on your knees and hips and so on. So you have to kind of work around that. And I think a lot of people, for longevity, you really want to keep the more you have to the more range of motion you have to go through with a joint under load, the more likely it is to be injured. So I think a good example is like that tornado guard. Like I basically tell no one to use tornado guard. That's where you basically you're in the splits and you're trying to like kick someone off from a full split. And I've known a few people that have ruptured their proximal hamstring tendon doing that. That's a pretty bad injury, like that's surgery. Ooh. and a long recovery for that. It's not like, I think playing something like half guard is going to be a much safer thing. The range of motion you go through when you play half guard is quite low. So you can kind of play a much slower game and keep everything quite tight, and your chance of getting injured is less. Apart from, obviously make sure you block the crossface. You don't want to sit there with your neck being twisted all the time. But if you're doing well defensively from there, I think it's quite a low risk position. That's why I like half guard, and I feel like I'll probably be playing it more as I get older, as it being a safer guard for the body. Whereas anything, like an open guard or, fighting out of a stacked position. So, you see people get stacked, and there's one thing to be stacked and kind of relax, but if you're and try to just kind of, even just let someone pass, but if you're stacked and pushing against your opponent, trying to push them off to get back to your guard, then you're actually putting a lot of strain on a fully, like the more you take something into the end of its range of motion and load it, the more chance of injury. So that's where back injuries are much more likely to occur. So I think, people choosing a style, my general thing is going for, something that, if you go for something which doesn't have a large range of motion, it's slow and is slower. So if the more explosive something is, the more we hit that high loading point, the more slow the movements are, the lower the load. And I think you see that, like, a lot of people can lift weights, and how many people, I mean, it happens, but how many like muscle tears, for example, do you see from someone doing bicep curls? You almost never hear of someone like rupturing their bicep doing a bicep curl. They'll do it by, like, something's getting stretched out and they pull it back, and it's kind of like an explosive movement. It goes in the same thing as that sprinting compared to walking. You can put a lot of strength into something at a slow pace, and the injury risk is much lower than doing it in a powerful, quick motion. So, being very aware of that intensity and speed of movement, especially speed of movement under load.
That's an interesting combination that you mentioned there, where you're talking about the ballistic movements, just like what we had discussed with sprinters,
Yes.
being at higher risk of injury because of the ballistic nature of what they're doing, and then being at those end ranges of motion and trying to resist. So, like, under load at the end ranges of a joint. From powerlifting, we did see quite a lot of ruptured biceps tendons, but not guys doing curls or anything, but actually they were deadlifting and so in the deadlift, you have one hand that's typically an overhand grip or pronated, and then the other hand is supinated, which is like, your palm is up, and that would be the one that they would rupture, because it's at the complete end of the arm's range, and they're pulling like hell.
Yeah, and I feel like it's I mean, you could probably tell me if I'm right, but there's almost like because you're trying to that initial thing, you kind of almost like there's a bit of like is there a pop to get the weight up at first, even though, like, I know you're not curling with a deadlift, but it's stretched, and you kind of like is there a good, like, amount of energy transference through the chain into the arm? Like, would you say it's a explosive use of the bicep? Or if
you're doing it correctly, no, you actually are loading up almost elastic force from the hamstrings. Because you're basically trying to build that stretch reflex through the hamstring to get that to do what's called loading the bar, or basically bending it. So someone who's good at that can lift like 135 to 225 pounds without lifting at all. Like, they're just building elastic tension in their tendons and ligaments. And I don't know exactly the place where those ruptures happen, like where it is in the lift. I only know that for the arm, like, you are forcibly locking it out as hard as you can.
It's definitely at end range. Or
so,
towards end range.
And I'm not in any way trying to play physio, because I'm just some dumb hillbilly from Kentucky, but having been in that world a little bit, I have seen that injury happen more than once, and that is definitely an in range position, because you're, like I said, you're forcibly locking it out as far as you can.
So definitely it fits the criteria there. I mean, obviously you get exceptions to that as well, but
certainly,
I think, like hamstring strains will almost always occur in runners in that outstretched leg position. That's a muscle muscle tear, actually even potentially tendon injuries. But once you take something to that the end of its range, they're stretching their leg out to get maximum power, and that's where you'll see injuries there. So it's a kind of common throughout. Not to say it can't happen in a shorter range, but certainly much less likely.
That makes perfect sense. And then, what you were talking about with, choosing the game for you, and someone getting stacked and just allowing that pass to happen. It's if you're resistant to it, I don't know what, percentage wise you're upping the risk of injury, but you're still loading that muscle or joint at its end range of motion. So just kind of, let the person pass, like it's okay. And if you're in the finals of ADCC, like our guest, then, hey, you can choose, like, you get to take that risk. But if you're, rolling on Tuesday with your buddy Mike, just let Mike pass today. Cause like you got stacked and that's how it went.
Yeah, I agree. That's again where it gets more difficult for a competitor, because like, for myself, like I want to have a strategy for if I do get stacked that I can try to not lose the match because of that. Like I have to
absolutely.
have a strategy to try to get out of there, not lose points, which does mean, fighting from a position that's more vulnerable for injury. But absolutely, if you're wanting to avoid injury risk and just, train for as long as possible, then you should let those sort of positions go and get better at not getting there.
Right. And I would guess that even in the sort of decision matrix that you're within, as you are training to compete at an elite level, when you're in your skill acquisition phase, if someone's stacking you up, you're just going to let that happen. You're not going to fight it off. But as you change to more your competitive phase, where you're lowering the volume, now you're going to be fighting for, more things, but still, just like you said, trying not to get there.
Yeah. I try to take, I try to take like that loading into consideration as well, because for example, if I think about the whole week or the last 2 weeks and I'm like, I haven't actually really been stacked, then I'm much more likely to be tolerant for one or two moments where I get stacked and try to fight out of it. Whereas if I was, rolling all week and I was like, geez, I've been stacked a few times this week, I'm much more likely to let it go, because I know I'm pushing. There's kind of like your general load, but you could break that same thing down to individual parts of your body and go like, okay, how much load has my back which is harder to do especially for the average person. I think maybe as a physio, I might be a bit better at that, but like,
Sure.
How much load has my back taken this week? How much load of my, my knees and my hips? That's definitely something I probably wouldn't tell people to try to log on pen and paper or anything, but it's probably something you could just be aware of. If you've worked a position a lot for the week, then just be careful not to overload that particular part of your body that's taking stress.
What you're describing there, just sent like this light bulb off over my head. I take a lot of pride in my leg lock defense. I practiced that a lot. I've drilled it a lot. I feel really confident in it. And I was wearing a pair of spats that I hadn't ever worn before, and it turned out that they were just a little bit stickier than anything else that I had. So someone put me in a heel hook, and I turned and I got out. But I felt like, that one was sort of close. I probably should have tapped. But, no big deal, whatever. Moved on. Didn't feel any soreness, didn't feel any, aggravation. And then later that week, same thing. And I'm not sure it was the same pair of spats, but I do know that someone got close on a heel hook. And once again, I turned and I got out. But I was like, man, that one was really close. I should have just tapped, like just using my head. Because I tap early, like normally.
Yeah.
I was just like, for whatever reason, these particular two, I just didn't catch on. And they were both the same leg, same heel hook. And I was sore for like, 3.5 weeks, just because I let that second one happen. If I had tapped early on either one of them, I would have been fine. But the two together, just like what you were saying, like that individual part, it just sustained more load than it was ready to handle.
Yeah, it's a hard one to to monitor, but it's like it's hard to keep track of, but it is certainly a consideration. Especially when you're in there and in the heat of the moment, and someone's, someone who maybe doesn't normally get you, and they they catch your leg, and you got to go, all right, I'll tap.
Yeah, and like I said, like I normally I'm a very early tapper. I'm not gonna fight with you. Like, if you caught me, you caught me. I shouldn't have been there. But this particular thing, I felt that there was some sloppiness in like their entanglement, and I could definitely break free. And I did, but it was just slower than I really was, normally used to. And I think I'm trying to blame it on the spats, but it was probably just sloppiness on my part, where I should have just said, "Hey, you got me. It's okay. Like, we'll come back at you next round." But that definitely was very instructive to me, because the second time I should have just said, I can't let anything get close. If anybody so much as wraps my foot, I have to tap before they even connect their hands.
Yeah. Actually, another thing I don't know if we talked about this last time, but I do feel I feel like there's a little bit less loading training no gi than gi, actually. I train both, but it is a consideration I think people might want to think about. The reason I think is, when you get a gi grip, when I grip something in a gi in my hand, a sleeve or collar, I can pull with 100% of my force and still have that grip. Whereas if I've got an underhook, or I'm holding someone's wrist or something, I usually can only pull as tight as before it slips. So you actually end up, it kind of almost forces you into that 70% kind of tension mode, I feel. Now, obviously there's certain grips, once you've connected your hands in a body lock, of course you can pull a lot harder, but I feel like a lot of the grips end up being less powerful, because it's more about tracking than controlling and moving their arm. And same thing on top. Like, if you're on top and someone's trying to break your posture, pulling on your collar, often that's like very tough on your back and your hips to fight that. Obviously, you've got a good deadlift, that's going to help. But
I wish I did.
Yeah. But I encourage people to train a bit of both, a bit of gi and a bit of no gi. I think it's especially for the average person, I think it's good. The more variability is actually, it means it's not the same structure of your body taking the load every time. You're actually mixing it up, which is more beneficial.
Yeah, I think there's a certain bald-headed instructor from New York that always wears rash guards, who he did a small treatise on training with the gi and without. And he said that without the gi, in terms of like your training benefit, because the grips are harder, you'll be better. You'll get better at your attacks and your pinning, because they'll have to be tighter, because you just don't have the gift of the gi helping you there with the friction. And then conversely, for your defense, training in the gi, it's going to make you a lot more technical, because you don't have a choice but to be. There is no just like ripping, like athleting out of stuff, because there's just too much friction. I
think it's I think a lot of people, especially when they start like training in no-gi, it takes longer to feel like maybe it's a shorter time to feel like you're good at getting out of stuff, but you're probably not really. You're just good at like
slippery. Yeah.
But it is a longer time to actually feeling like, oh yeah, I can control someone in the mount. And I do think gi maybe gives people a more positive experience. Like, you really feel, I feel like when you first start, if you're training the gi, you really go like, you walk away from that session like, I could not do anything against that person. Like, I couldn't move. And you go, geez, jiu-jitsu really works. Whereas maybe if you're going against, if you've just started and you're going against someone with 6 months experience, you might still be able to kind of thrash your way out of some things in no-gi and not see how, I guess, powerful jiu-jitsu can be. But yeah, so I probably slightly would prefer people when they start to have the gi on, but I do encourage both.
That makes perfect sense. And I think it might actually even encourage the person, to use your word, not to be as ballistic as, for as long. So like, if you don't have a technical solution, typically you're going to resort to an athletic solution.
Yeah.
And the gi may teach you, just because those athletic solutions don't work, that you need to start finding technical solutions, because you are flat stuck, like it's just, you can't.
That's right.
So I can definitely, I think I can definitely see what you're saying there in terms of what the early training value might be, just psychologically, is like, in order to turn off that athleticism, if it's working in no gi, you're probably less likely to do it for a while.
Yeah. Very true.
That leads me to another thing that we discussed, and I was hoping that we could expand on it in this discussion a little bit more. You said that some of your early encounters with Craig Jones, he rolled so almost like effortlessly or lightly that you were kind of having to tell him to toughen up a little bit. And so I was kind of curious about that, because it sounded to me, and this was purely, I listened to it a couple of times, so I'm not going to try and pretend that I understand what you were saying, but it was like up until and maybe through purple belt, he was just in this like years long or months long skill acquisition phase where he was just letting things happen, learning to feel all kinds of different positions, and just building almost like this proprioceptive base that then once he turned it on in terms of his athleticism, the skill, he had a very deep skill well to draw from. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because I really wanted to hear more about that myself.
Yeah, it's actually something I've noticed. Quite a few of the people, like, I've been training for 17 years now. So I've seen quite a few people go from, beginner phase all the way through to being excellent black belts. And I'd say one thing that many of them have in common is rolling at a lighter pace and flowing and troubleshooting, and, the other things like troubleshooting and, really thinking about what they're doing. That's probably the other thing I've noticed. But rolling at a lighter pace and trying to get a feel for the movement, essentially like having that idea that if the technique's right, then I don't need to force it, and that's something I noticed with Craig. When I rolled with him as a purple belt, he was very relaxed, and he probably too relaxed for a competitor, but excellent for, I think it's excellent for that skill acquisition. And, and he was, don't get me wrong, he was, as a purple belt, he was giving me a hard time. He was giving a lot of people a hard time, but I was kind of like, okay, this guy's giving me a hard time, and he's not even like putting like a lot of effort behind what he's doing. Like, what's it going to be like when he adds that? But I think for the average person who's not trying to compete, they could aim to be like what Craig was without necessarily adding the intensity behind it. And you can still be giving, good black belts, and when you get to black belt, you can be beating, good black belts at that pace. You see that, you hear those stories, people, a good black belt goes and rolls with, one of the legends of the sport, and they're like, man, he wasn't even trying and he beat me. And that's kind of what you want to aspire to. And by going harder doesn't get you any faster to that level. It probably actually reduces your chance of getting to that level, because you're paying less attention to what's going on and you're more likely to get injured. So yeah, Craig kind of had that. Yeah, what I would say. And he's still, I wouldn't say Craig's an ultra aggressive competitor. Like, he's not like a, snap down and shoot and kind of frantic. So he's got a very methodical style, but it's certainly got a bit more intent behind it now than it had then.
So talking about that, I guess what I was going to ask is, back in 2017, I watched the match between you and Craig. I'm not sure that they put it up live. It was MA1. It was in a cage. And this was both of you. This was not just Craig. Like, this is the Lachlan Giles interview, so we're not going to be blowing up Craig's ass. Like, screw that guy. But the speed that both of you and the accuracy, especially in the leg entanglements, was really, I don't want to say like mind-boggling, but it was clear that you both had drilled those movements for a very long time, and like probably good at that point. I think so fast that I would have to rewind it several times to catch, like the subtleties of the changes because they were happening so fast. And so I wanted you to kind of talk about the lead up to that match going into ADCC 2017, where obviously Craig had a very breakout performance, and then what maybe you learned that led to your breakout performance in 2019.
Yeah. So in that match, I mean, yeah, that match with Craig, he's already beating me in the gym. So I kind of thought I have to change the tempo or something to have a chance. So I tried to be as explosive as possible, which is not my normal style, but it actually seemed to work better for me, even though I didn't win, but actually probably had a better performance than I normally would in our roles. So I was still happy with with how it worked out. But yeah, I suppose, when you know each other's game as well, then you start kind of, you're looking for counters, and you can kind of almost predict. You're both predicting what's going to happen next, so it kind of can look a lot more, probably even more exciting because of that. Because you see that kind of playing off each other's knowledge there. Sometimes it can look really boring as well when no one does anything, but that's another way. It depends I think it depends on the what the person has in mind, the competitors have in mind. I think we both wanted to at least put on a good fight, like both go at each other. So, yeah. So, I mean, I think it was good to see Craig do so well in 2017. We at the gym had been rolling with him and like his improvement, the amount he had improved in the lead up to that, it was kind of hard to know, like, as in, like, I was like, geez, he's really good. Surely he can transfer that to the elite level, but you don't know for sure. You're in Australia, in a country that's not known as a jiu-jitsu powerhouse. Like, you haven't seen what Craig can do rolling with some other competitors at that level. So it was great to see him being able to achieve that. And I think that's pretty inspiring for everyone in Australia to see, okay, like someone from Australia can do this, then we can do this. So I'd probably always, I'd been taking my training pretty seriously even before then. I decided for ADCC, I decided to have a very narrow focus. I really focused on my wrestling and my leg locks. And that was like probably 80% of my training was focused around those two things in the lead up for probably 1.5 to 2 years, in the lead up to ADCC. So I really tried to narrow it down, and I felt a lot more confident doing that. I knew exactly where I wanted the fight to go. I wanted to get to a leg entanglement, and I had the strategy if I couldn't get a leg lock and we go to overtime, then I can try to wrestle. So yeah, that was certainly what I worked on, and yeah, obviously the leg lock side paid off in the open weight, so I was happy with that.
Yeah. What was fun for me about that, I'm going to shill your product for a moment because I have the leg lock anthology.
Oh no.
and it was, it was a huge bolster to my game. I'm a lot more dangerous to my training partners. Sorry guys. But because of the things that were taught in there. But one of the things that was so cool was, I don't remember which DVD, I think it was close to the end, the position sparring and stuff in the gym, and then watching a lot of those positions that you had troubleshot over and over and over again with your training partners popping up, at that world level with, these freaking gorillas that you were rolling with. And I was like, oh man, they don't even know, like, because I've been watching it, I was like, this is going to be bad.
Yeah. Yeah, it was I actually find the process of making an instructional to be extremely valuable, because I don't like to, I really want it to be as good as I can make it. Like, so I take longer than some of the other people to put out a product, because I really like, or at least from my point of view, I want to like put out my information that I know, like I kind of write it down and I'll film some of it, and then I'll film myself rolling, and I try to take note of, is what I'm doing when I'm rolling what I'm saying in the instructional, because sometimes I teach something. It's quite often actually, I'll teach something in class. I'm like, this is how you do an armbar. And then 2 days later I'll do an armbar and I'm like, oh, I'm doing something different to what I said. So then I have to come back and adjust. I try to take note of that. Like, why am I doing this different to what I was telling my students? And then once I realize it helps me understand it further. And then I can teach it better. But I think without actually being a coach and having to do that in front of a class, I probably wouldn't. Sometimes you just don't recognize what the difference are between what you think you do for a move and what you're actually doing until you've taught it. When you teach it, it makes you go through that process, and then you come back and you will teach it better. But also now you actually understand what you're doing, and like you understand it to a better degree because you've gone back and recognized that. And often that it makes it more effective because you go, okay, like, if I'm doing my heel hook, my aim is to do this. This is how I'm going to react to that scenario. You'll see it coming a bit earlier, and you'll kind of get it to work better. So I think I finished filming that leg lock anthology maybe 2 weeks before ADCC. And so it was like, I felt like the act of doing that filming and like all the adjustments I'd made had really like elevated my game to peak at that point. So yeah,
you almost periodized your the skill acquisition via filming that instruction.
Pretty much.
So we'll have to see what you get.
It's funny. I spent because after ADCC, I was like, oh, I'll spend a bit of time not doing leg locks. There's some other things that I wanted to work on that I'd put to the side because of ADCC. And then, so I was working other things. And then, a month or two later, I went back to my leg locks. I'm like, oh, I'm getting sloppy at this now. Like just taking the focus off. So it's hard to juggle everything.
Well, that's something that, I also kind of wanted to talk with you about is that, You've said quite a few times that your game as a competitor has changed numerous times. You've gone through quite a lot of phases, and there are some very famous competitors who have always basically competed under the same game, and won multiple world championships with it. And then there are some others who are maybe more generalists, like they're pretty comfortable in a whole lot of different places. And they're almost like counterpunchers, So talk about that, like that sort of domain specificity and expertise versus being more general. Like what do you see as what are the clues for someone that they should be one or the other in their training?
Yeah, I think, look, I think if you look at majority of competitors, I'd say most of them, you could name their move, or their move or their position, like you're watching Leandro Lo. Oh, he's going to do his collar grip. He's going to look for his single X, he's going to use his Toreando pass. Like usually you can specify that. So there's a pretty clear, it's quite obvious that if you want to perform your best, you're better off having like a position that you try to play. I think that's really important. But I also think there's a general skill set that you need as well. Like I think if you put Leandro Lo in butterfly guard for a moment, like I think he could still use it. He'd still be good at it. He might not be great. He's not going to force the fight there. But if you forced him into butterfly and left yourself open to a sweep, he's going to be good enough to be able to sweep a good black belt from there too. So I think like you want a general skill set, but some specificity for competition. But I think for a general training, like I just find that boring if I just do the same move. If I'd done the same move for the last 10 years, I just find that a boring process. And although you get very, you refine it and you find a lot of value in the intricacies of it. That's what I actually like the most about jiu-jitsu is like trying to find the little details that, you've been doing a move for a year and then you realize like, oh, if I just do this, it makes it 10 times better. And I can't believe I didn't see that before, or, I'd never learned that. But those sort of things I find almost the most exciting thing about jiu-jitsu. But I still think it's a bit boring to do the same thing over and over. So I tried to get myself to a decent level. Like when I say decent, like to the level where I could use that game like as an A game in competition. So I think as a black belt, I've gone through phases where I would use spider guard, single leg X and X guard, probably combined with butterfly there. I've had half guard. I've had a decent period where going into worlds, I'm going to use half guard as my go-to. De La Riva and Berimbolo, even probably at the very start of my black belt, I was kind of playing that game. So probably never close guard. Not that if I get there, I'll try something, but it's not my A game, close guard. I've never had that as like my sole goal of a tournament to get to close guard. But I'd say a pretty broad range of things that I've tried to use, and so I think there's value in that as well. And there are competitors who seem to be a bit more open to just kind of fighting from wherever the fight goes. Like I think someone like a Zanjay Ribeiro, you watch him, if he's standing, if he's on his butterfly guard, close guard, on his back, on top, he doesn't really care. He'll just fight you wherever you are. And he's a hard one to game plan against because wherever you are, he's going to be very well rounded and good. Whereas there might be others who your game plan would be to really direct it towards something, but also keep it away from something else. So, but I'd say overall, it's more the very specialist fighters are more represented. So that's probably a better competition strategy. But as a person training in the gym, I say learn anything and then or everything. And then once you find I would say get very good at one thing, like have a game. But then once you've got that game, start learning other things as well. And then you might find that something else becomes your game because you really like it.
That's a fascinating point of the idea of just like what you said there, because when you like it, you also said that you would feel bored if you were doing the same thing over and over. So two elements of your athletic performance are personality derived. They're not like body type or, like, am I a big, strong guy or, am I ballistic or, am I good endurance? It's just like, what also can I tolerate training for a long period of time? And so you're bringing your personality into that. And I think that's something that I wouldn't have considered, in terms of high level athletics. I would have looked at it, obviously I'm not a high level athlete, so I can't say it from experience. I'm just saying analytically, I would say, how do we build this athlete into what, they're going to be able to most readily express. And then what you're talking about with the personality element of is, well, what can you enjoy training the most and therefore train the most and become the best at? And that's a different consideration, one that I probably wouldn't have thought to make.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably the best model is what I did between ADCC 2017 and 2019 was actually a very specific, like I kind of identified what my speciality was going to be. And I directed everything towards that. And I did find the best, that was definitely my best year of performance was 2019. So without a doubt, I think that's good, but I don't know if that's the most enjoyable way to train. So that's probably you got to weigh that up, because if someone's not excited to get to training and it's, they're not thinking about it a lot and really enjoying the process, then I don't think you'll get as much out of them. So.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Just the difference of excitement. Like, so to kind of give a little bit about my background, I'm an airline pilot, and previously I was a flight instructor, and I really loved flight instructing. A lot for the same reasons that you were saying. Like in teaching, I would figure out things that I was doing and become deeper in them because I had to convey it to someone who didn't understand it. So there was, there's been a long evolution of what did I enjoy most. And most recently, the things that I've enjoyed about flying have had less to do with the physical act of flying and more to do with being a leader and a captain and, like setting a tone and creating an environment. And that evolution, if you had taken me back 15 years, I probably, wouldn't have felt that excited about this element.
Yeah.
You know, like I've evolved into it. But I think as a player, obviously, as a recreational player, that's going to happen. But I guess I hadn't, you know, put my mind or even considered that just being excited to train is itself an athletic booster.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's some good research that like on people's, you know, how well people learn something. And I think like how much, but their state of mind and whether they're enjoying the process is a pretty strong indicator. Like, you know, it's quite strongly correlated with how well someone learns. So yeah, in a sport like jiu-jitsu, where learning is perhaps the, you know, how fast you learn or how well you can pick up new skills or identify problems and so on, it might be the most important thing. I think that's a pretty important thing to encourage and facilitate in training.
You know, that takes us all the way back to the very beginning of the discussion, where in jiu-jitsu, the most skilled person usually wins. And
yeah,
you know, that's all the way at the top, you know, the pinnacle of the athletic side of the sport, which is exciting to me. That's a very exciting concept.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I apologize.
No, that's right. Yeah. I mean, it's, I still think I think, you know, like if you look at, you know, Rafael Mendez or someone like that, who I'd say is extremely technical. Of course he's strong and he's got flexibility and all those factors, but I don't know if he's necessarily the strongest in the division, you know, compared to everyone else, or at least not compared to how strongly he would dominate the division, is not equivalent to his physical attributes, but his technical attributes, you know, are clearly the main driver of his success. But obviously at the elite level, I actually think it matters less than in the gym. So as in like other factors start mattering even more at the elite level, because there's a bit of diminishing returns on technical prowess, I guess, like, you know, how
at the world level, everybody's world class.
Yeah. I mean, it is. I mean, there is a difference. It's weird because there is still a technical difference. It just kind of shows you the ceiling is almost never ending to that, but it's never ending. But I do think it's diminishing returns. You know, like if I had to say someone in their first year might, you know, improve by 100 points in technique, you know, we just break it down like that. Whereas their third year, it might be by 20 points. And then, you know, between year 15 and 16, it might be like 3 points. But that's still in it. You know, that might matter a lot, but it's still, it diminishes kind of slowly over time, I think, as you improve, as your knowledge improves. But whereas, you know, maybe at that level, adding on more, you know, power or whatever, like flexibility or some other attribute might give you a 3 points as well. So it could become more and more useful to work on your attributes later in your career necessarily than earlier.
That's a fascinating thought, because I just think of every white belt in their first 6 months keeps saying, I got to get stronger and I got to get you know, like more cardio. And it's like, well, actually, maybe you ought to just get better at jiu-jitsu. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's more and more applicable the earlier you're on in your journey.
Well, I think that's a great place to end, because we've talked about the highest level of competition. We've talked about longevity. We've talked about injury prevention, and we've even thrown a couple of things in for the white belts too. So I think we've covered a really broad base of just about everything I wanted to get with you. If someone wants to learn more about you and learn from you, what are some ways that they can get a hold of you, Lachlan?
Yeah, so you can follow me on, I got Instagram, Lachlan_Giles. I've got a YouTube channel, Absolute MMA St. Kilda. And I've got my instructionals as well, so through BJJ Fanatics. And if you get them, if you can use the code Lachlan10, it will save you 10%, and it also gives me an extra cut as well. And I've got some material on the Grappler's Guide as well, which is kind of a platform that has a bunch of different instructors, and I've got some content on there too. And if you use the code Lachlan, I think that saves you 30%, and that helps me out a bit too. So yeah, if you're gonna check those out, if you use those codes, that's better for me.
So let's definitely help out Lachlan. He's a friend of the old rollers, and we're going to be a friend to him.
Awesome. Thanks, Harrison.
Well, Lachlan, thanks so much for your time. We're going to wrap it up